good afternoon and a warm welcome to all of you to this book talk with Raffaella Del Sarto and Tamiras Fakouri on Raffaella's latest book, which is titled Borderlands, Europe and the Mediterranean Middle East, published by Oxford University Press. This book talk could not be timelier, I think, as we are witnessing a war of aggression in Europe's borderland in the East, to which the EU has reacted in cohesion, employing sanctions, while also providing shelter and protection to refugees from Ukraine. Now, seen from the Mediterranean Middle East, which is our perspective today, this is maybe not an EU we have become used to in the last decade. So I think maybe today is also a moment for our research to consider all the research that we have pursued and to take stock and look forward how we can take this forward also in light of this historic moment we are in. And so apart, of course, from taking stock in the first part of the webinar, when Raffaella will present the book and Tamiras will discuss it, there's also in the second part where we look a little bit forward, thinking about the what's next question in the second part. Now, before giving the floor to our speakers, I would like to shortly introduce them. Raffaella Del Sarto is Associate Professor of Middle East Studies and Academic Director of the MA in International Affairs at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Bologna. Prior to this, she was a professor at the EUI's Schumann Center, where she directed the Borderlands research project funded by the European Research Council. Her research interests and areas of expertise include international relations of the Middle East and North Africa, particularly in relation to Europe, the domestic foreign policy nexus, questions of regional orders, borders, and interdependence in the Middle East, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and Israel's foreign and domestic policies. Turning to Tamiras, she is Associate Professor of Political Science and Global Refugee and Migration Studies at Aalborg University in Copenhagen. She's also Scientific Advisor to the Kuwait Chair at Sciences Po in Paris. Prior to joining Aalborg University, Tamiras was an Associate Professor at the Lebanese American University and the Director of the Institute for Social Justice and Conflict Resolution. Her core research areas are migration and refugee governance in conflict areas, international responses to forced migration, norm contestation in the international system, the European Union's external migration policy, and power sharing and ethno-sectarian conflicts. Now, last but not least, I would also like to mention that this book talk is also happening in the framework of the EACEA Jean-Monnet network, and I will say a bit more about our upcoming activities and that network before I will conclude the webinar in the end. So now I would say, please all keep your microphones closed, and Raffaella, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniela. Thank you to the EUI, to the Istituto Affari Internazionali for hosting this event, and also thank you, Tamiras. So let me start by giving some definitions. So the book is called Borderlands, Europe and the Mediterranean Middle East. Now, when I talk about Europe, I mean the European Union and its member states. When I talk about the Mediterranean Middle East, I basically talk about the area from Morocco to Turkey, which are basically Europe's so-called southern neighbors. The focus of the book is on two aspects of the relationship between Europe and the Mediterranean Middle East. The first one being trade relations, and the second one, the cooperation on migration, security, and border controls. And the book focuses on a time span of 20 years, from 1995 to 2015, which is basically from the start of the Barcelona process or Euro-Mediterranean Partnership to a major revision of the Europe's policies towards North Africa and the Middle East in 2015, which also coincides with the so-called refugee crisis. And the book takes issues with some prevailing concepts in the literature, both normative power Europe and fortress Europe. Okay, so this is the area we're talking about. As I said, Mediterranean, Middle East, from Morocco to Turkey. The book is not dealing with the Gulf countries. Now, in order to understand the relations between Europe and the Mediterranean Middle East, I think that there are a few characteristics which are important to take into consideration. The first one is certainly the role of history, and that is the role of European colonialism in the Middle East, because European powers shape the political and socio-economic development of the modern Middle East. The second one is geographic vicinity, because the Italian, to give examples, the Italian island of Lampedusa is closer to the Tunisian coast than to Sicily. The distance between Spain and Morocco is 14 kilometers at the narrowest point of the Strait of Gibraltar. And well, it takes 1 hour from Rome to fly to Tunis and about 3.5 hours to fly to Beirut or to Tel Aviv. The third point is that there is a very complex web of relations in place between Europe and the Mediterranean Middle East, which are very easily overlooked. There is a free trade agreement in industrial goods with most states of North Africa and the Mediterranean Middle East, with the exception of Libya and Syria. With Turkey, there is a customs union. The EU provides technical and financial assistance to all of these states. The hydrocarbons play a very important role here. And there is also a cooperation on security and migration control. And the fourth point regards the type of European policies, which are linked very much to the nature of the EU, of Europe. Of course, the EU is not a state, but it is in charge of trade and aid policies. And it is composed of 27 member states that have to agree on foreign policy decisions. And in all of that, the EU is the largest trading partner of most states of all states in North Africa and the Middle East. Now, I have called the book Borderlands, and I also adopt a lens, a Borderlands approach or conceptualization to these relations. Why? Because a Borderlands approach captures core periphery relations, because this is what we're talking about. It also accounts for the fact that Europe is a very particular political entity, namely one with partly disaggregated functional and in part also disaggregated territorial borders. And it also captures the nature of European policies, which is about expanding European rules and practices to the neighborhoods, whether south or east. And in this, the cooptation of elites is very important within this broader picture. It also captures, talking about Borderlands, a Borderlands approach, it also captures the main interests of Europe vis-a-vis its so-called southern neighborhood, which is security for European citizens and economic benefits. Of course, there's nothing wrong about this in principle. Every state or political entity is doing this, right? The book then goes through the development of Europe-MENA relations since the founding of the European Economic Community in 1957. Back then, important to keep in mind, often forgotten, is that Algeria was still part of France until 1962. An important development was the introduction of the Common Agricultural Policy in 1962. That had to do with the experience of food shortages during and after World War II. And it is basically about protecting the European agricultural market by providing subsidies and restricting imports in agricultural products from third states. And the book then also discusses the Mediterranean policy from the 1970s onwards, where we see basically a Europeanization of the former policies of the colonial powers. The Cold War context was important here. Greece and Turkey were given priority. They were offered the prospect of EC membership. Other Mediterranean countries obtained trade preferences. Here, important to keep in mind that at that point, the Mediterranean partners also included Spain, Greece, and Portugal, and also Malta and Cyprus. No? And what we see by adopting a borderlands perspective is that it was actually always about security, about European security. It was always about the stability of North Africa and the Middle East and market access. Also because in this period, in the 1970s in particular, the events in the Middle East had a much greater impact on Europe than, let's say, on the United States. Thinking about the 1973 oil shock, which brought to light, made it clear how dependent Europe had become on fossil fuel from MENA states. I'm, should I say old enough, should I say mature enough to remember the car-free Sundays, and in order to save energy in European countries. And well, we might get back to this considering current events, but that is another story. It was also a period of terrorist attacks in Europe that were linked to the Arab-Israeli conflict. And it was also in the 1980s and 1990s, the issue of migration also became an issue. That had to do with the economic decline of most MENA states. End of the Cold War, certainly many new hopes, the beginning of the Arab-Israeli peace process, hope on the one hand, but the Algerian civil war caused quite some fears in Europe, with the fear that terrorism would spill over, fear of unwanted migration, and also economic problems in the MENA region basically continued. We come to 1995, so I'm really doing a quick run through history, the history of relations. Now we get to 1995, the European Partnership is launched, also called Barcelona process, new round of free trade agreements in industrial goods are signed, agriculture is excluded, the idea of structural reform, aid, and from that moment on, a neoliberal model of development is adopted, which is different from what was the case previously, because there were trade preferences. And there was also the idea to create a Mediterranean region and a real free trade area. A little bit fast forward, 2004, the introduction of the European neighbourhood policy, which had much to do with the so-called Big Bang enlargement of the European Union of 2004. Here, there was a shift to differentiation, bilateralism. It was pretty much the end of the Mediterranean region as an idea. Now, if we look more concretely at trade relations, so the general structure is that we have a hub and spoke system with the European Union at the center. The free trade agreements that were signed in the 1990s remain the basis, as I said, with the exception of Syria and Libya, which do not have a free trade agreement with the European Union. There were some additional protocols that were signed over the years, some liberalization in agriculture, some liberalization in trade and services. The picture is also that MENA states participate in various programs of the European Union, programs and projects, which go from projects on aviation, open sky agreement, for example, research and development, justice reform programs, administrative reforms, projects on statistics, democracy programs, democracy promotion programs, and so on. So you name it, there are many activities going on. And the EU provides basically training and aid for the restructuring process that the free trade agreements require from the countries in North Africa and the Middle East. Now, in all of that, I'm mainly talking about the Arab states because Turkey and Israel are outliers in this regard. Turkey has a customs union, as I said, has also been accepted as a candidate country for EU membership, although that is on hold at the moment. And Israel has a more advanced type of economic relations with the European Union. Now, what has been the impact of EU trade policies? Now, first of all, I have to say that it has been it is difficult to assess the impact of European policies. Why? Because they cannot be isolated from the policies of the United States and from the international financial institutions. And also because MENA countries are heterogeneous, they have different they had different starting points and also different responsibilities. Interesting here also again why it has been difficult to assess the impact of EU trade policies on North Africa and the Middle East has to do with the state of the literature, because we find many studies on expected trade potential and very few studies on very few post-factor analysis, in fact. But what we can say, and that this applies to Arab states and Turkey to a certain extent, is that overall the trade volume has increased, but we still have the basic patterns of core-periphery relations. The trade balance is usually in favor of the European Union, with the exception of hydrocarbons. We see typical post-colonial patterns of trade flows. There's a very typical division of labor in terms of who exports what to whom. And what we can also say is that European companies and MENA elites have profited most from this development. What we also see is when we look at the state of, let's say, of capitalism in North Africa and the Mediterranean Middle East, well, there is a clear case of crony capitalism linked to the fact that MENA elites have basically captured the economic liberalization process. We can take here the examples of Egypt and Tunisia, who were the poster children of economic development, and they received praise and large European private investments. In Egypt under Mubarak, for example, around 30 business people with high-level political connections controlled around 500 firms. And by the end of the 2000s, these companies earned 60% of the overall profit in the sectors in which they operated. Tunisia under Ben Ali, very similar picture. In the wake of the 2011 uprisings, this is when the assets of Ben Ali and his family were expropriated. The wealth of Ben Ali and his family was estimated at a staggering 1/4 of Tunisia's GDP. But it only employed approximately 10% of the workforce. What we also see in the countries of North Africa and the Middle East are rising inequalities and unemployment. Interestingly here is that a study of 2007 that was funded by the European Union said this is to be expected. And it basically the study recommended mitigating policies to prevent these rising inequalities or the expected rising inequalities and rising unemployment. And these mitigating policies were supposed to focus on job creation, education, vocational training, social policies. What we also see in the time span under consideration is a strengthening of authoritarian rule. And of course, here the question is, well, is that Europe's contribution? Is that Europe's fault? Now, what we can say is that it's not a direct cause, it's not a direct impact, but we can say that European and MENA business elites are interconnected. We can say that the European Union has relied on corrupt MENA regimes for its trade policies for decades. And we can also say that unchecked neoliberal economic systems are perfectly compatible with authoritarianism. So in a way, what we can say is that Europe allowed these regimes to enrich themselves and become more repressive. Now, as regards European policies on security, border controls, and migration. Now, migration has been, unwanted migration, I should say, has been a European concern for decades. Of course, it wasn't always like that. I mean, after World War II, the picture was very, very different. But let's say that from the late 1970s, 1980s onwards, migration from North Africa and the Middle East became a concern in European capitals. Now, we're talking about migration policy. We have to take into consideration that here the role of the member states, of the EU member states, is much, much stronger. This is a competence of member states, largely. What we see is that Europe has adopted very restrictive migration policies towards North Africa and the Middle East. It has applied conditionality as regards migration control, which grew even stronger after the Arab uprisings. There was a lot of pressure and also promise of benefits in return for cooperation. There is an array of shady agreements on counterterrorism, police cooperation, and migration control that is in place. My colleague Jean-Pierre Casarino has a fantastic database on the different types of memoranda of understanding and agreements that concern police cooperation and migration control. So within all these different types of agreements, there are also readmission agreements, which are basically agreements that by which a third country commits itself to take migrants and refugees back that went through its territory to Europe, applying also to third country nationals. And of course, there are also all these type of agreements on counterterrorism, which are also very, very shady. Again, this is not a prerogative of the Europeans. I should say the United States has also quite some this type or similar type of agreements with a number of states in North Africa and the Middle East, which also apply to extraordinary rendition, torture, and so on. What we have also seen is that the EU's external borders have moved and multiplied in a way, because borders are not where you think they would be. Why am I saying that? Because we could think about the border between Italy and Libya, for example. You would think they should be somehow close to the Italian coast if these are Italian border controls, but this is not the case, because there are joint patrols between Italy and Libya off the Libyan coast. French border police is present in airports in North Africa, and so on and so forth. This whole policy of single European EU member states with regards to migration control relies on the cooptation of MENA governments. Basically, European states provide training for border police authorities in MENA states. Again, the example of Italy and Libya is, I think, illuminating. European countries sell or donate hardware, which includes surveillance technology, drones, patrol boats, etc., to MENA governments. And well, we see that in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings and the so-called refugee crisis, the European attempts to co-opt MENA governments even increased. And this has certainly been epitomized by the 2016 deal between the European Union and Turkey with regard to Syrian refugees. The EU also provides funding to MENA states to keep refugees in their country. That applies, for example, to Lebanon and to Jordan as well. Now, what has been the impact of these policies? Well, these are the pictures that we know all too well. What has been the impact? First of all, important to note, between 2014 and 2020, 20,000 refugees and migrants are classified as either dead or missing on their journey across the Mediterranean Sea. These are the numbers from the IOM, the International Organization of Migration. There is a problem with the surveillance technology that European governments give to their so-called partners in North Africa and the Middle East, because of course MENA governments can use these against their own citizens. And here what we see, the general picture is that Europe has actually rewarded MENA regimes for remaining oppressive and unaccountable as long as they keep unwanted people out of Europe. Who has profited most from this securitization of migration? Well, unsurprisingly, the European arms industry. And MENA regimes, well, they have become very, very good in talking the talk, gaining legitimacy in European capitals because they present themselves as a bulwark against either Islamist terrorism or migration flows or both. But the criminalization of migration has become stronger within their own countries, so there's a stronger control over citizens. We have seen the pictures of refugee centers, so-called detention centers, subhuman conditions, for example, in Libya. And what is basically happening is that Europe has been accepting severe violations of human rights and international law at its fringes. And at the same time, if this wasn't enough, it has also given quite some blackmailing power to the strongmen in North Africa and the Middle East, whether this was Gaddafi in the past or Erdogan in the present and others. So to conclude, what I've tried to do with my book is to propose a different perspective on the relations between Europe and the Mediterranean Middle East, because I think that it's very useful to understand the past and the present of Europe's engagement with its so-called southern neighbor. And the point is here that despite various reformulations of European policies over the decades, European policies have basically remained pretty much unchanged in the last decades. After the Arab uprisings, that's perhaps a major development, that after the Arab uprisings, the focus on security and on migration control has become even stronger. If we're thinking about the impact of European policies, well, they're neither positive nor encouraging, because European security and business interests have trumped any attempts to seriously promote the respect for human rights in the so-called southern neighborhood. The Europeans have de facto tolerated and partly contributed to the accumulation of power and wealth by repressive MENA rulers. And from this perspective, the Arab uprisings should have not come as such a surprise to anyone. And a final word on MENA governments and regimes. Of course, they're co-responsible. I'm not saying everything is Europe's fault, certainly not, right? MENA regimes have profited from the EU's economic policies. They have very often used anti-Western rhetorics or anti-European or anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist rhetorics, no, to divert the attention. The question is really, how sustainable is repression in combination with worsening socio-economic conditions for the majority of the population? How sustainable is that in the medium and long run? Thank you.
Well, thanks so much to you, Rafaela, for presenting so excellently this really crucial and very solid research to us. With this, I would directly give over to Tamiras. So with this, Tamiras, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, first of all, Daniela, for organizing this book talk, and thanks to the Institute of International Affairs that always provides us with a unique space to talk about relations between Europe and the Middle East. And I'm very thrilled to have the opportunity to discuss Rafaela's book. So surely this is one of the most comprehensive books that not only explores the relations between Europe and the so-called Southern Mediterranean, but that I think also goes a long way towards conceptualizing these relations and making sense of what has happened in the last decades. So in what follows, I would like to reflect a little bit on the contributions of this book and suggest some implications for research and policies. So as we all know, much has really been written on the Mediterranean as a dual space of conflicts and solidarities. And much has also been written on Euro-Middle East relations since the 1995 Barcelona process. Nevertheless, there remains a conspicuous gap when it comes to integrating these multiple schools of thought into a comprehensive framework. And I think that the book does so through the analytical lens of the borderlands, or what Raffaella defines as hybrid zones of crossover between Europe and the Middle East. So through this lens, the book accounts for how cross-cutting political, economic, and trade deals have been made, but also unmade within the EU Middle East space. It also zooms in, as Raffaella so brilliantly illustrated, on the policy contradictions, the slippages, and the structural inequalities between both regions. Of course, my aim here is not to provide an account of what Raffaella has written. Rather, I'm going to flesh out very briefly 3 aspects in the book that I think that it strongly consolidates. So first of all, I feel like the strongest merit of this book is that it really brings together the multiple strands of literature written on the Middle East and Europe. So something that I've been asking myself personally is that why Euro-Middle East studies have remained not only fragmented, but also strongly dictated by changing geopolitical exigencies or imperatives. So just a quick overview of this literature. In the 1990s, as the book also illustrates, in the context of the multilateral Euro-Mediterranean partnership, we have seen an abundant literature on the EU's normative power and its capacity to diffuse democracy and economic liberalization in the Middle East. A decade later, that there has been a shift, and instead, scholars have shifted the gaze to the EU's security imperatives. So particular emphasis has been placed on analyzing the European neighbourhood policy and its bilateral relations with its Middle East partners through the frame of security, trade, and migration management. So moving on to the Arab uprisings in 2011, of course, we were thrilled to see like a short-term, enthusiastic scholarly wave asking whether sweeping anti-regime protests are going really to recalibrate the EU-Middle East relations. However, as soon as these protest waves degenerated into conflicts, this short-term enthusiasm faded away. And then again, in the context of refugee flight from Syria, emphasis was again placed on the so-called migration security nexus, through which the EU manages displacement from afar and comes up with an array of technologies of distance to keep migrants and refugees from the Middle East at bay. So in this regard, scholars have lamented the EU's so-called principled pragmatism that entrenches deep polarities and dilemmas in the Euro-Mediterranean space. So what this book, however, does is that it brings together all of these multiple strands of thought, which I thought was really fascinating, while at the same time paying specific attention to economic relations and border policy. So this gives, I feel, the reader a unique opportunity to assess the evolution of EU-Middle East relations in a longitudinal perspective and to ask several questions. For instance, where are we at since the adoption of the Barcelona process 27 years later? How has the EU continuously expanded its borders in the Middle East while at the same time succeeding in keeping the Middle East as a periphery or as a borderland? And can the EU today offer the Middle East something beyond an interest-driven strategy? And notwithstanding these long-standing trade, commercial, and political relations, what is it that the EU can offer the Middle East today? And in exchange, what is it that the Middle East can offer the EU? So I think these are crucial questions that the book, behooves us to put into perspective. So the second comment that I would like to make is that the book offers an interesting and critical conceptual engagement with how regions depend on each other, but also co-constitute each other. So Raffaella, you lend a specific attention to the EU as a normative empire, and you call this, as perhaps as a daring attempt, because you try to, illustrate how the EU has pursued its security and economic interests in the Middle East, while at the same time diffusing norms and practices in the region. And you also very well account for how the EU technically seeks to transfer governance regulations to the so-called periphery. At the same time, you shy away from this, reductionist perspective that inquires into the EU Middle East space as an abstract trans-regional entity. And you give us, such a wealth of examples into how context-specific policy legacies, historical legacies, and economic shocks, as well as conflict spillovers within and from the Middle East, have shaped EU-Middle East relations. So against this backdrop, and this is the part I like best, I think that the book manages to go beyond a one-sided perspective that looks at the Middle East through the lens of EU-derived ontologies and terminologies. So one of the chapters that I would have loved you to speak about, which draws specifically on this rich literature on contestation and leverage, seeks really to understand how the Middle East has reappropriated the EU's policy frames, be it in migration management, economy, or politics. And the findings are here particularly interesting. So in so doing, this chapter unlocks, according to me, an important question. How can the Middle East and Europe be seen today in relation to one another? And how can we leave the domain of polarized Eurocentric studies and decenter Western knowledge on the Middle East? And how can we engage with both regions through the lens of relational geographies and through the lens of reflexivity? So the third and final point that I wanted to raise is the following. What are the implications of this book for what we are going through right now? So in the current geopolitical order following the outbreak of the Ukraine-Russia war, the EU is undergoing strong societal, policy, and security shifts. And academics have rushed in no time to make sense of how the EU would act next in the context of this watershed juncture. However, perhaps we should stop a minute here. So an arising question is, what can we learn from what we already know? How can we use, for instance, the rich literature on EU-Middle East relations to understand the EU's behavior in times of crises, wars, and economic shocks? How can we leverage the methodological, conceptual, and empirical tools we already have at our disposal? And can they be of use in those critical times? So many questions come to my mind. For instance, under what conditions does the EU mobilize as a unitary entity? And what can history tell us about the circumstances under which EU member states mobilize, disengage, or polarize in times of conflict? And the history of Euro-Middle East relations is really ripe with examples. Also, can we learn something from how the EU has acted in the context of refugee flight from Syria to make sense of the current temporary protection directive or of EU states' responses to displacement from Ukraine? And last but not least, how will the Middle East be impacted through the reshaped relationship or non-relationship between the EU and Russia? These are just two questions among many, and I think the book, offers really a fascinating lens in order for us to ponder these questions and beyond. So from this perspective, and just to wrap up, I feel like the book is an invaluable source that goes beyond the specific case of Euro-Middle East relationships. Firstly, in terms of understanding how regions co-constitute each other through slippages and power practices and hybrid crossovers. And secondly, in terms of how the history of Euro-Southern Mediterranean spaces can come in handy here, allowing us to gain timely insights into trends at the heart of EU security and patterns of engagement and disengagement in times of polarizing conflict.